Good morning, and welcome to Greenwald's coffee break. We will be presenting results among caregivers from the annual Retirement Confidence Survey conducted by Greenwald Research and EBRI each year. My name is Lisa Greenwald. I'm the CEO of Greenwald Research. I specialize in research related to financial and retirement planning. I manage the Retirement Confidence Survey from the Greenwald side of things. And the Retirement Confidence Survey this year included an oversample of caregivers. In total, the survey included 944 caregivers out of a total sample of 2,537. To help us understand the caregiver results that we're looking at, I am joined by my partner in crime, Lisa Weber-Raley, who can introduce herself.
Thank you, Lisa. You've got the Lisas today. I am the Chief Research Officer at Greenwald Research, and my functional area is in healthcare research. But really, I've been working in the caregiver space since I started at Greenwald 16 years ago. So I think for the depth of knowledge that Lisa Greenwald brings in the retirement space, I'm here to sort of provide some context around the caregiving space with a lot of the work I've done in partnership with National Alliance for Caregiving and AARP. I have some color commentary on the results that we have from the RCS, and I think it's a really valuable look at caregivers.
All right, well, we're going to dive into sharing some results with you, but our goal with these coffee breaks is always to be a small casual group. So if you have questions or comments, please do not feel shy. You can jump on video or audio. We'll also be monitoring the chat, but however you feel like joining the conversation, you are welcome to. And I certainly hope you have grabbed your cup of coffee as well. So the Retirement Confidence Survey, which fielded in January of 2023, largely found that caregivers, those who are caring for an adult or a child and performing either an ADL or an IADL or multiple for their care recipient, are rating their physical well-being, their physical health, their financial well-being, and their emotional well-being less positively than non-caregivers. And the lowest on that list, which we'll focus on, of course, because it is the Retirement Confidence Survey, is the financial well-being, which just over a third of caregivers rate as excellent or very good.
So I'll chime in here because I think that this is really important context for the caregiving space. We've done a ton of work on caregivers. We understand what their experiences are like, how they vary among caregivers, but I think this provides important context in comparing those who are in a caregiver role versus those who are not. And I think for me, the thing that jumps out is that blue bar. They're not currently caregivers, but they may be in the future. Right. So they may be facing some of the challenges that we're about to walk through today. The other thing that I would be remiss if I didn't say is, we're going to talk about some of the financial impacts on caregivers, and it may feel kind of gloomy or bad. But I wanted to point out that, not everything about caregiving is a negative. Many caregivers find a deep sense of meaning and purpose from their role. So I want to make sure that I point that out up front before we dive into some of the impacts that these caregivers are feeling.
I mean, it is pretty amazing, Lisa, that you find that people find purpose in this, because it's an additional responsibility. And these results would suggest that it has, I'll borrow a word from a colleague, suboptimal impact on mental health. You can see here, this is among our caregivers. Nearly 2/3 say it has had a major or a minor negative impact on their mental health, their physical health and well-being, and then some critical components to financial well-being, being able to save for emergencies and save for retirement. Little lower on the list, but still 46% say that caregiving has had a negative impact on their ability to manage the household finances. And then a couple here about a negative impact on being able to work the hours you need or want, or be able to retire when you want, right? So it's having an impact at work as well.
And from a caregiving perspective, when we talk about caregiving, we talk about not just this idea that maybe if you aren't currently a caregiver, you probably will be in the future or be a recipient of care. But we talk about the ripple effect of caregiving, right? So, and that ripple, when you imagine a rock being thrown into water, has smaller ripples that then exacerbate or move outward and have longer legs. And we do see that in a variety of areas. We see that in terms of physical health, right? Physical strain of actually providing care. We see that on family life and trade-offs that one might have to make in terms of how you spend your time or your downtime. We see that in terms of emotional or mental well-being, in terms of work, and also in terms of finances, both in the short term, right? That's so short-term savings, but also long-term, that retirement planning. So I think this is really sort of complementary data to what we know about caregivers and the challenges that they face and how it impacts their lives.
We do, although retirement for many of our respondents in this study is still years away because we start surveying folks at age 25, see that short term, that save for emergency. There's some other things happening that we captured in the RCS with short term financial needs. And that is, interestingly, that fully half of our caregivers say they are providing financial support to their care recipient, and nearly half of them say that amount is $5,000 a year or more.
Yeah, and AARP did a great study in 2021 to estimate the amount of money that caregivers are spending annually on providing care. And typically it's significant. It's about $7,200 a year. And when you look at the median incomes of caregivers, it equates to about 26% of one's income being spent on caregiving. That's not insignificant and therefore not surprising that you're going to have to make some financial trade-offs.
So the other short to midterm problem, self-described problem for caregivers that will ripple into a longer term impact is that caregivers in the Retirement Competence Survey, nearly 2/3 of them, were more likely than non-caregivers to say that debt is a major or a minor problem for their household. So you do see that compounding impact, right? Caregiving was impacting the ability to save. Now the debt is impacting negatively the ability to save for emergencies, but also what some of our clients are very interested in seeing as well, it impacts their ability to participate in workplace benefits, right? So the retirement plan specifically, but also other benefits such as life or disability insurance.
And we see this in the caregiver research that there's a variety of financial impacts that caregivers face, especially those caregivers that are in intensive sort of 24/7 care situations, right? When we think about a caregiver, let me let someone in. When we think about a caregiver that maybe is just helping cut the grass of their elderly neighbor, right? That is caregiving, but maybe the financial impacts are not as strong. But when we talk about someone that's providing hands-on care a long period of time, this really can exacerbate the financial impacts.
So again, all of this combining, we see that caregivers have heightened concerns, very somewhat concerned about things happening in the economy and its impact on them in the long haul for retirement. Things like the cost of living, making it harder for them to save, another compounding effect impacting the ability of caregivers to save. cost of living in the here and now, salary and work compensation not keeping up with inflation, having to make substantial cuts to spending because of inflation. 69% of caregivers are concerned that their investments will lose value over the next 12 months, so that's not significantly different from our non-caregivers. And then perhaps more as might be expected, and a very dramatic difference, our caregivers are more concerned about having to provide care for a loved one. And they're also more concerned about a health event preventing them from working.
Yeah, I think those 2 points, Lisa, really jumped out at me as a health researcher, because I think in some ways caregiving, when someone's thrust into, and typically it is thrust into, about over half of caregivers report they had no choice into taking on the role of caregiving. They're given in some ways a crystal ball as to what their future might be in terms of their own health and how to navigate that system. A lot of caregivers report learning about navigating the healthcare system through the experience that of their loved one. So in some ways, they have some knowledge of what might happen and a heightened sense of the risks and implications for their own planning that come along with that. So I think that this here is sort of further evidence that there's some increased conversation and attention among caregivers for these realities that many of us will face.
Yeah. And we actually have a little more on that, I think, still to come. One of the things I found really interesting was that this is not an issue of knowledge. Caregivers and non-caregivers rate their knowledge about managing their day-to-day finances, about managing their savings and investments for the future, and their knowledge of about their employee benefits the same. Right? What's not the same and is critical is caregivers are more likely to believe that their long-term financial needs are different, they're unique. And they're unfortunately more likely to agree that they don't know who to go to for financial or retirement planning advice. I think this last one is also interesting as well. At least it's not what I would have expected. I would have expected, given the role of caregiver, that there are other priorities for that household, for that person. But here at the bottom, we see that only a third of caregivers agree with the statement that retirement savings is not a priority, meaning the other 2/3 think it is. And that's the same as non-caregivers.
Yeah, I mean, that one's tough because I think there's again a diversity of experience within caregivers. And so when I think about, a adult child, right? Typical, what you think of as a typical caregiver, which would be someone in their late 40s caring for an aging parent, typically a woman, that they're seeing the impact of their parents' retirement savings. So I could see where that may become a higher priority, right? The vast majority of caregivers are in their working years. So I could see maybe that's sort of a variation there. So I think everyone has kind of different priorities depending what's going on in their life. And so while I think there are some unique things about caregivers, I think it's important to remember that within the caregiver group, there's probably some different variations and emphases to place in terms of financial planning, which is why I think it's really important that financial companies, financial advisors are having these conversations with caregivers about some of the challenges they may be facing.
So taking both the current financial well-being of caregivers and what Lisa was saying, that they may be drawing on the experience of watching and caring for an aging relative in some cases, in many cases, we actually see that our caregivers are less confident about a whole variety of factors related to retirement preparation specifically. So they're less likely to feel like they'll have enough money or less likely to feel confident they'll have enough money for basic expenses. They're less likely to feel they'll have enough for medical expenses. Overall, they're less likely to feel like they're going to have enough money to last their lifetime. And again, taken all together, fewer agree that they're doing a good job preparing for retirement. This last one for me on Social Security was also interesting, right? That caregivers are less confident that the Social Security system will continue to provide benefits of at least equal value to the benefits received by retirees today. And I think we know for women, but also especially pronounced for caregivers, that when income is lower, when work is intermittent and interrupted, it impacts Social Security benefit amounts ultimately. And again, as Lisa was saying, I think people may be drawing from their own experiences of what they're witnessing with their family members.
Yeah, and I think we see comparable data in the caregiving in the US studies. We see caregivers as a result of caregiving, they're stopping savings, they're racking up more debt, they are using up their short-term savings, they're using up their long-term savings. And those impacts, those financial impacts, are more common among lower income and younger caregivers. So that idea that I am in my prime working years and therefore having to take a break from work or, not saving as much will erode one's confidence in what's ahead for you in the future.
So again, if you add up everything that we've been discussing so far, it's probably not a huge surprise to see that our caregivers are less likely to feel confident that they will have enough money to live comfortably throughout their retirement, which is the benchmark question of the Retirement Confidence Survey. And while less likely, again, what's sort of amazing to me with RCS findings overall, but especially with this audience, 60% are still confident. They're less confident than non-caregivers, but 60% are still confident. And the real difference is there at the very versus the somewhat. So a couple other items that I thought was interesting. In the RCS, we often talk about expected retirement age. We capture and trend that. We talk about the desire to work in retirement versus the reality that relatively few retirees actually do. So wanted to share some of these findings. So the median age that workers expect to retire and that retirees report they actually did is the same among caregivers versus non-caregivers, right? Expect to retire at 65, actually retired at 62. But when we asked our workers, have you adjusted your target retirement age? A quarter of them say yes, which is more than among non-caregivers. And more often than not, they say they have pushed that date out. They now plan to retire later. On the right side of the slide, we're looking at our retirees. Did they in fact retire earlier, later than planned, or about when they thought? And here we see no difference between our retired caregivers and our non-caregiver retirees. Sometimes that's a mouthful, sorry about that. Where there is a difference is in the reason for retiring earlier. We capture a whole array of reasons and categorize them into in the respondent's control or out of it. Caregivers who retired earlier than planned are much more likely to say it was for a reason outside their control.
Yeah, and so from caregiving in the US, we do deep dive into work and trying to understand how many caregivers actually work and what work impacts they've faced as a result of caregiving. And among caregivers who have stopped working, and that could be they retired early, they just quit wholesale, they've taken a leave of absence. The main reason, the overwhelming reason, 70%, is that they need more time to provide care. So when you think about the 52% of retirees that are, of caregivers that have retired earlier than planned, and that being a reason out of their control, right? It could be that idea that I just need to focus my attention and time and efforts towards my loved one that needs my help right now. But then you also have recipients. Recipients are typically, as you get older, peers, right? Spouses, siblings, cousins, friends, and neighbors. People working can have their own health changes and challenges that require them to sort of opt out of the workforce earlier than planned. So I think that sort of both of those things may be happening here. But I think it's not surprising to me that, these caregivers are really essentially having to choose how to spend their time, and needing to provide care wins.
So another interesting thing happens related to work among our retirees in the Retirement Confidence Survey. Caregiving retirees are more likely to say, yes, I worked in retirement. Right? It's not an overwhelming amount. It still doesn't come close to comparing to how many think they're going to work in retirement. Both working caregivers and non-caregivers believe they're going to work in retirement. This is sort of an American phenomenon. But among retirees, the reality for caregivers is different. They are more likely to work in retirement. And then looking at all of our caregivers together, they're also more likely to say they're doing gig work. Caregivers are more likely to be doing gig work. It's not a huge percent. They are more likely to be doing it.
And we have some anecdotal evidence in caregiving of caregivers structuring, sort of, rather than structuring your care around your work, you're choosing to structure your work around your care. So you're maybe doing some sort of sales, something home-based business, right? Part-time work, gig work, and structuring that in a flexible way around the care that you need to provide at certain phases in your life cycle of being a caregiver. It's interesting because in the 2020 Caregiving in the US study, we saw that 11% of our caregivers said that they had to take on more work, a second job or a new job, or start working when they hadn't been. So, this is 2023. We've been through a pandemic since then, an economic downturn that we are arguably maybe still in. So, I wonder how much this sort of economic climate has shifted pressures onto caregivers to need to take up work at a higher rate now.
So here again, we're sticking with just our retirees. And we always ask about their expenses and whether or not they're higher, lower, or the same as expected, right? So it's relative, but as expected. And while not statistically significant, we see 54% of our caregivers say their overall expenses and spending is higher than expected. Where we do see a significant difference is caregivers saying their housing expenses, their taxes, their travel, entertainment, and leisure are higher than expected. And then more expected, I think, for us, we see our caregivers more likely to say they're spending more than they expected to support a family member, or they're spending more than they expected for long-term care expenses. I think one of the things for Lisa and I, we were discussing it before this conversation, was around travel. It's hard to know, though. I think Lisa's got some good data points from caregiving in the US, what that travel expense really is and why that's higher for caregivers.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have two hunches here on, I think, for me, housing and then that travel line item. Housing, we know there's some proportion of caregivers that either choose to move into their care recipient's home or vice versa, have their care recipient move into their home. And so then they have to make some changes, whether that's building ramps or installing a chairlift or, sort of basic like home improvements or changes. So that might be going in that housing expenses that's sort of not planned for. Some people do have to move, sell their own home, move closer to their loved one. The travel thing jumped out at me because we do know that there is a fair proportion of caregivers that are spending a lot of time on the road, for lack of a better word, to provide care. So we know that 1 out of every 10 caregivers travels an hour or more to be able to provide care to the recipient. And among baby boomers who are caregivers, 1 out of 10 are traveling more than 2 hours to provide care. So gas expenses or flights or wear and tear on one's vehicle, perhaps public transportation if one needs to take a train or a bus or something to get to provide care, are all real things. And I think when we think about travel, entertainment, leisure, we tend to think, ooh, fun travel, a cruise for retirees. But there may be actual travel expenses as just to provide care. And I think that might be a sort of a blind spot of financial planning.
So one other thought I had was, combined with the providing financial support, caregivers may also be paying travel for their care recipient to come to them.
True.
Right.
True.
So for our retirees who in some cases are going back to work or facing higher expenses, we also see that our caregiving retirees are more likely to say that their overall lifestyle in retirement, and this question wording includes volunteerism, social activity, and some other items called out specifically, holistic lifestyle, is worse than what they expected. 31% of our caregivers say their lifestyle in retirement is worse than what they expected.
Again, I think that just points to the ripple effect that many people have, right? If you are spending, oh gosh, I think it's like 20 some hours a week, that's the average care that's provided. That's 20 hours a week that maybe you are not volunteering or attending religious services or being able to spend time with your other friends or family. So it's a significant change, a pivot in terms of how one thinks about their time. And maybe it's not quite what was planned, right? I think, again, with over half saying they really had no choice in taking on their role, they're thrust into a situation where they are making the best that they can out of it, but it might not quite have been what they expected their retirement to look like.
So hitting just a few highlights as we wrap up, right? Our caregivers are suggesting and telling us that their overall well-being is worse emotionally, physically, financially. We see a certainly off balance sheet. Caregivers have more debt and less savings, and yet many are still providing financial support to their care recipient. We see heightened retirement concerns and lower confidence. We see caregivers overall doing more gig work and caregiving retirees more likely to go back to work. We see that our retired caregivers are potentially, as a result, reporting that their overall lifestyle in retirement is worse than they thought it would be. And they're reporting some higher than expected expenses in retirement. And the real bottom line of the retirement confidence survey every year is who's confident, and caregivers are less confident than non-caregivers in their ability to live comfortably throughout retirement.
And I to put this into context, this is not a small proportion of Americans, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about in 2020, we had 22% of Americans American adults were caregivers. That's 53 million people. Then we had a pandemic that required people to provide care to others. We don't know how that prevalence has shifted. The assumption is it has gone up, that more people have had to take on care as a result of the pandemic, especially when you think about the impact the pandemic had on things like long-term care homes, nursing homes, assisted living centers. Many people made the choice to move their loved one back into a home-based setting. So it's not a small proportion of folks out there feeling this financial strain and being less confident in their retirement. So I think it's important to keep that in context.
Absolutely. Any questions or comments? Lisa and I are happy to discuss. All right, hearing none. This and all other Greenwald coffee breaks are available on Greenwald's website. We encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn as well for future invitations and notices of the availability of the recordings. We talked a little bit about the intersection of work and caregiving. So I will also say that the EBRI Greenwald Workplace Wellness Survey is in field right now and will also feature an oversample of caregivers. And so really looking forward to sharing those results with you in the fall to understand more about how caregivers are navigating workplace benefits in particular. We thank you very much and hope you have a lovely weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.